Hello and welcome everyone. It's good evening from me. My name is Amin Lutfi, and I want to welcome everyone to the 10th lecture in the Middle East Institute's 101 series. Today we have a talk lined up for you titled Religion and Politics, Religion and Political Islam in the Middle East and its Impact on our region. I'm very honored to have with us today Dr. Norshahril Saat, who is a senior research fellow at the ICS Yusuf Isaac Institute, located next door to the Middle East Institute here at NUS. Dr. Saat holds a doctorate in international political and strategic studies from Australian National University, and his research, apropos to our conversation today, focuses on the Middle East's influence on Southeast Asia and the broader geopolitical implications of this connection. Amongst other things, his recent research include his research was on Singapore's Islamic graduates and their role and impact on a plural society. Drawing on his broader research interest, today he will be giving us a socio-historical overview of the layered relationship between the Middle East and Southeast Asia via the story of Islam, moving away from a very narrow focus on terrorism, which unfortunately has been the hallmark of the post 9/11 landscape. Dr. Saad gives us a more holistic overview of this layered relationships and the many ideological battles that kind of divide and the social connections that bring this region together. So without much further delay, I want to pass it on to Dr. Saad. Just before I do that, I want to remind everyone that at the end of the lecture today, we will have a Q&A session like always. Send in any questions to the MEI events team and they will forward it to me and I will read it out to Dr. Saad and we can have it answered. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Saad, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Right, thank you, Amin, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here speaking to you about a research topic that's very close to my heart, dealing with political Islam in Southeast Asia. And as mentioned by Amin, I think he has summed it up very nicely for me that the focus for this presentation today is slightly different from what we often hear, right? When we talk about Middle East impact in Southeast Asia, we tend to focus on radicalism and terrorism, especially in post 9/11, which is definitely an important topic. But I think we need to look beyond that and look at the multi-layer issues surrounding this topic. This is the second time I'm giving this lecture for this ME101. I really enjoyed it, especially the questions and answers sessions. I gave a similar talk last year, and I received very good questions from the audience, and definitely it sharpens my mind, and also I try to revise some of my thoughts upon listening to comments and questions. And I certainly look forward to the questions and answers session as well. And hopefully we can have a very engaging Q&A session. As Amin shared, MEI and Southeast Asian Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, now known as the ICS Yusuf Isaac Institute, we are neighbors. And I must confess in the beginning that I'm not really a Middle East expert. I'm more of a Southeast Asian researcher. I mean, I work on Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia in particular. And generally, the topic today will be looking at these three countries closely. But I do have a strong interest in the Middle East. I read about Middle East very regularly. And I've been to a number of countries in the Middle East as well. Definitely Saudi Arabia because of pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. I've been to Egypt for research purposes, as well as many other countries. I've been to UAE, Jordan, and I think based on what I'm going to share today is based on my experience visiting these countries. And as Amin earlier mentioned, there are many layers to this. It's complex, and we should not simply make some broad generalizations when we talk about Middle East impact on our region. Right, I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. So this is an objective of today's lecture, to articulate trends in the Middle East pertaining to Islam, to identify the implications of these trends on Southeast Asia, namely 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore in particular. That's what we do in IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. I mean, our research is not mainly academic research solely, but also looking at policy implications, right? So I think that's important to highlight at this stage. And thirdly, the objective is to address the complexity of the Middle East impact on Southeast Asian Islam. Let me start off by looking at 3 countries, just to give a brief overview of the status of the 3 countries today. Why is Indonesia important to Singapore and also in the region, in fact? Because it's the largest Muslim country in the world. The largest Muslim country in the world is not in the Middle East, it's not in Saudi Arabia, even though Islam originated from the Middle East, but it's in Indonesia. Large population of 255 million, and this is only a rough estimate. And 87% of its population are Muslims, but interestingly, it is not an Islamic state. It's not a secular state. It is called a Pancasila state. But over the years, it has been ruled by presidents who are Muslims. And simply saying 87% of population are Muslims is not enough, because the Muslim society, the Muslim community itself is fragmented. It's not homogeneous. There are many different ideologies, different ideas, different groups, and civil society, which makes Indonesia a very complex country. So Indonesia has 34 provinces, and even though it's the largest Muslim country, it has a Ministry of Religion, which not only oversees Islam affairs, but it oversees 6 official religions. And Islam is really very active at the civil society level. It has 2 major organizations called the Nahdlatul Ulama and the Muhammadiyyah. Scholars tend to simply say that, you know, NU, which is the largest organization in Indonesia, represents traditionalist Islam, Muhammadiyah, the modernist Islam. But in reality, this dichotomy is very complex. And it also has, apart from the religious ministry, a quasi-state institution called the MUI, which mainly houses the religious scholars called the ulamas. So that's a quick snapshot of Indonesia. It's a very complex, but I only have 1 slide to show you about this complexity. You can read up more about Indonesia. The second country of focus is Malaysia. Different from Indonesia, it's relatively smaller, but majority of its population are Malays and Muslims. But different from Indonesia too, it's clearly indicated in the constitution that Islam is the religion of the federation, though generally it is a secular country because other religions are allowed to be practiced in peace and harmony in any part of the country. There are 13 states in Malaysia, but what is unique about Malaysia is that the head of state is the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, or the Malay king, and it housed 9 royal families. And the royal families are interesting because they are actually the heads of Islam and Malay culture in their respective state. So even though they're neighbors, a lot of differences between Malaysia and Indonesia. Singapore is in between Malaysia and Indonesia. And different from Indonesia and Malaysia, Muslims are a minority community. The latest census in 2020 states that 15.6% of the total population of 5.69 million are Muslims. Majority of the Malays here, because in Singapore, what is popular is the CMIO model. We have the Chinese and the Malays, the Indians, and the other communities. Malays constitute the minority, but majority of the Malays are Islam. Are Muslims, right? So they profess to be Muslims. So 98.7% of them. There are also, even though it's a minority community, there are institutions in the state which solely pertain to the community, particularly the administration of the Muslim Law Act for AMLA, which also means that there are institutions cater specifically for the Malays and Muslims, such as the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, or MUIS, MUIS, and the Sharia courts, which handles Muslim marriages and inheritance. Right, so that's a snapshot of the 3 countries that we are looking at today. So that's the status today, current status. But I think to look at the Middle East impact in Southeast Asia, we need to look back at history to understand, to give you a snapshot of overview, right, of the Middle East impact. So here are some of the brief generalizations about Muslims in Southeast Asia. Majority are Sunnis. For those of you who may not know, I think you may want to Google what is the difference between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. There are minority Shia communities, but majority of them are Sunnis. Majority uphold the Shafi'i school of jurisprudence. That's very interesting. There are 4 schools of jurisprudence generally in Sunni Islam: the Shafi'i, the Hanafis, the Hanbalis, but Shafi'i is the most dominant school of thought. Majority, as I mentioned earlier, are Malays, especially in Singapore and Malaysia. Indonesia is quite, it has to be explained further, because there's a distinction between Malays and Javanese, particularly in the island of Java. But majority, in a way, associate the Malay culture with Islamic values. In terms of orientation or religious life, I would argue that Sufism at one point of time, and probably still is, strong in Southeast Asia. And here by Sufism, I'm loosely defining it here. I mean, the practices which Salafis or the Puritan groups would consider as bid'ah or innovations, right? Such as the celebration of the Prophet's birthday or Maulid, visitation of graves of prominent ustaz or ulama, or reading a certain specific prayer at a specific time. These are considered as, to the Puritans as innovation, but it's strongly practiced in Southeast Asia. So Sufism remains strong, and I'll explain to you why. And what's unique about Muslims in Southeast Asia is that the traditional ruling elites, as I mentioned earlier, especially in Malaysia, the Sultan, the Raja, Yang di-Pertuan, were seen as symbols of Islam and as the custodians of the religion. Maybe you don't see this in other Muslim countries. So Islam had spread to Southeast Asia from the Middle East are more the Sufi type, that emphasizes on rituals, devotional elements of mysticism happen. But at certain periods of the history of Southeast Asian Islam, it also encountered the reformist movement. So what I'm trying to say here is that Middle East Islam is also not homogeneous, right? There were ups and downs. There were different ideologies at certain periods of time. One could argue that, from Prophet Muhammad, there were different civilizations after that. At one time, Shiism was so dominant during the Fatimid Caliphate. And then we have the Ottoman Empire, and then Egypt, of course, had the reformist movement. So there were ups and downs. I mean, changes, evolution that happened in the Middle East, and I'm trying to say that they had its impact is also felt in Southeast Asia. So at one time, we have Islam that came to this region, maybe the ritualistic, emotional, mystical type. But at one point in time, there was this tension between the reformist group, or some would say modernist group, the Puritan group that came from the Middle East to Southeast Asia in the 18th to 19th century. And later part, and this is a very important part, a crucial part, in 1970s, another wave of Islamic ideology came to Southeast Asia, and this is what scholars would term as the Islamic Revivalist movement. Here we can witness the rise of organizations, like Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi Wahhabi, Iranian Vilayat Ifaqi, global Sufism, particularly after 911. All this came to 1970s, and my point is that we want to understand Middle East Islam in Southeast Asia today. We have to understand history. That's one. And number two, we have to understand the dynamics that were at play in the Middle East, and which groups are spreading Islam here, which groups were more dominant, how they came here, what are ties, what were the networks, right? So these are some of the important questions that we need to ask before we make sweeping generalizations about Southeast Asian Muslims and the Middle East impact. So before I confuse you further, I explain to you the key takeaways. First, Middle East impact has always been neutral to Southeast Asia. But as I mentioned, there were ups and downs. Today, what we're seeing is that we often get or take from the more conservative voices that's penetrating religious life in Southeast Asia. But that doesn't mean there were no progressive voices in the Middle East, right? So Middle East should not get all the blame. That's one takeaway. Number two, the Middle East influence on Malay language and culture is not new. It's taken centuries, right, since the coming of Islam, and there were interactions. And Malay and language and culture, like all cultures, like all native cultures in Southeast Asia, will continue to evolve, and the vocabulary will continue to expand. And the influence is not necessarily Middle East. It could be West, it could be Korea, it could be Japan, or it could be Middle East. So it will continue to evolve, and it's not only a linear process. So my point is that Arabization, this whole idea of Arabization discourse in Southeast Asia, needs more nuancing. Number three, this one is important. We tend to look at history and perhaps problematization, right, of this so-called Middle East threat to Southeast Asia. But sometimes we tend to look at it post-911 rather than looking at a more longer process of 1970s of the revivalist orientation that came from the Middle East. And we want to understand also who were the local drivers then, because the local drivers then, they were young people on campus, are today the leaders of the respective countries. So you need to look and understand, right? Give some attention to this whole discourse of Islamic revivalism. All right, let's go back to the earlier parts of Islamization into Southeast Asia. I mean, you can read further about this, how Islam came about, and as I mentioned earlier, why Muslims or Malays at that point of time hold a certain orientation. Why was Maulid dominant, allowed? Why was certain laws allowed to be practiced, certain cultures allowed to be practiced? It was because the early Islamization were quite neutral to that. And you can read Cesar Adib Mahul here, theories on the introduction and expansion of Islam in Malaysia, to understand who brought Islam to this region, right? And who were the actors? How come Islam spread so quickly? What were the motivations? What were the kind of society that was prevalent, right, in Malay society that actually brought in Islam, and what were the kind of interactions that happened? So Islam that came in, when it may be brought by the Hadramis or the Sufis or whatever, but it had to negotiate, right, and also in a way mixed with local practices, local customs, political system, trade laws, or even criminal laws. All these interactions took place. There was some negotiation that happened in the early phases of Islamization that explained why certain orientations were prevalent. Why were the Malays Shafi'is? Why were the Malays Sufis? Why were the Malays quite open to Malay cultural practices? So you need to understand the history. And maybe Cesar Adib Mahul's work here can give you a sense, of the kinds of Islam that happened in the early phases of Islamization. But a snapshot is that Islam that came in from Arabia, largely from Hadramaut, today's Yemen, interfaced with a feudal society, very authoritarian, very hierarchical, strength of the feudal lords, warrior class, all these things happened, right? Mysticism was commonly practiced during that period. So we see again the intermixing of this and why certain orientations are dominated in the Malay world and continues to do so. So a very interesting work is Shahruddin Ma'ruf, From Feudal Lord to Capitalist. Read the first 2 chapters and you can understand what kinds of Islam were prevalent and why it remained so. Because certain classes in society tend to use Islam or tend to promote a certain kind of Islam that would benefit the ruling class at a point of time. Another evidence of why I said that Sufism is very strong, this is a picture taken from a very famous shrine. For those of you in Singapore, if you drive ECP and before going to MCE Tunnel, you will encounter this shrine along the highway. This is the shrine of a famous Habib Noor, believed to have the mystical powers, believed to be a saint among many Malays, right? Which shows that the Sufism remains very strong, and the role of the Hadramis, descendants of the Prophet, also play a very significant role in forming the religious authority class in the Malay world, in Singapore, Indonesia, and also in Malaysia. These are some examples of the Middle East impact. I just go through very quickly some of the books. If you look at Azumardi Azra's book here, I have it here with me, a very important book that talks about the early networks of Southeast Asian scholars and the Middle East. They moved, they traveled to the Middle East, they learned, they came back, and there was a lot of interactions between students, amongst teachers and students, amongst teachers and teachers, and they went to the Middle East, brought back, and created some form of a discourse, right? A religious discourse in the Malay world, right? So I think it's important to understand the early phases. So it's not only Middle East coming here and spread Islam. On the other hand, we also have local, those from the Malay world going to the Middle East and then learning Islam and bringing back some of these ideas to Southeast Asia. So it's a two-way process. So the impact of Southeast Asian is the Middle East is quite mixed. There was a very enriching exercise in terms of enriching the vocabulary of the Malays. So certain concepts, Arabic words were used in the and included in Malay vocabulary. Conception of God, Allah, prayers, Salat, heaven, Jannah. Now, these are all Arabic words that are commonly used by the Malays today. Today's context, people may say that, oh, what's happening to the wish, Selamat Hari Raya, today we wish Eid Mubarak. Or people don't say terima kasih anymore, or thank you, right? In Malay, but people say shukran, or you're welcome, it's afwan, people tend to use Arabic words now, but that process actually happened all the time. In fact, when I was growing up, Malays don't use the word salat, for prayers. People use sembahyang, and people may say that this has Sanskrit origins. So there's a lot of intermixing, and it actually enriches the vocabulary of the Malays. Alphabets, Arabic alphabets were also used. This is where the Jawi script came about. But not all Jawi alphabets are found in the Malay vocabulary. for instance, the letter C, we don't find it in the Quran or the Arabic language. So they actually took from the Persian as well, and also other parts of the world. So it's not solely Middle East. It's also other parts of the world that actually enrich local societies everywhere, right? Adaptations also happen in terms of architecture. This is a picture of old mosques in Singapore. Some have domes, some have kampong structures. So societies evolve, and they take what's fashionable during that particular period. Similarly, in terms of designs as well, Islam do have an impact. Of course, caricatures of animals or humans are not encouraged in the fabric. So flowers, calligraphy were used, and it also adds color, right, to the social and religious life of the Malay community. But of course, there were other movements that happened during that period, and one of it was actually, as I mentioned earlier, was the Reformist movement that sought to reform religion. And again, Middle East played an impact. So today, maybe the Middle East is associated with conservatism or Puritanism, but at one point of time, the Reformist movements in Southeast Asia also borrowed from or copied the struggle from the Middle East. Like Sheikh Al-Hadi, for instance, based in Singapore, very much influenced by the modernist movement of Muhammad Abduh in Al-Azhar University. They mimic the journals or writings, a lot of contestations happening in Singapore. Right? Another example is the formation of the Muhammadiyyah movement in 1912. Again, this is where the reformists has an impact, where students going to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Medina, coming back, and then trying to purify and reform the locals. Of course, some of the tensions are religious and theology, such as against innovations or against bid'ah, but there are also positive aspects. The use of, for instance, science and rational thinking, how you determine the direction of prayers using compass. These are all modern thinking that were incorporated. And of course, education for women, and this all began to rise. And actually, it also has drew some of its lessons from the Middle East. Okay? This brought challenges to the traditionalists or the conservative groups in the region. This is another example of a tension. Oh, by the way, I'm not encouraging you to watch too much films, but just to let you know, this movie, Sang Pencera, is a story of Muhammadiyyah. It's available on Netflix now, so catch it while you can. Yeah, so I like this movie. It's a very good movie that captures the history of the modernist movement of Kiai Ahmad Dahlan. There were, of course, tensions as well between the so-called the progressive reformist group and the traditionalist groups, as I mentioned earlier. Those were ulamas or religious scholars who were mainly functioning in the religious courts. So this is a book by Professor Hamka that actually was very critical of the Mufti of Johor, right, the chief ulama of Johor, and of course for differences in terms of theology and also understanding of what is innovations, what is right Islam, and so on. So these are some of the historical records that prove these tensions, and here is origins from the Middle East as well. So at this stage, some notes for us to consider before I move on. So Islam is mostly neutral. Normatively is neutral about local cultural practices. Though some elements like monotheism may be conflictual, but generally Islam allows for the local cultures to survive. There were tensions in Southeast Asia, and these happened to be in line with developments in the Middle East, the Wahhabi movement, developments in Ottoman rule, and so on. So it happened in parallel with developments in the Middle East. As I mentioned earlier, it's not always negative. Even until today, it's not always negative, but it requires some form of rethinking before we say that that everything that comes from the Middle East is problematic to the religious discourse here in Southeast Asia. Which brings me to my next point. In the last 15 minutes or so, I want to talk about more contemporary issues. Right. So when we talk about the earlier phases, Middle East impact, there are progressives, there are conservatives, there are also tensions, and it happened here. But 70s onwards, there was a significant change in terms of attitude. You must understand this whole historical episode of the 1970s of the Islamic Revivalists, to understand contemporary developments of Middle East and Southeast Asia relations. A lot has been written about this. I don't want to go through, but there were certain episodes that affected the Muslim world. One of it is the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, series of wars, formation, the Arab-Israeli War, for instance, right? Gulf War, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So what did all this episode tell us? The Muslim world was basically suffering from, in a way, colonialism. Their morale was very low at the point of time, and they were subjects to colonial rule. Right? So in a way, some felt that the Muslim world was going downstream, and there was infighting as well. So between so after the Ottoman Empire fell, so who would be leading the Islamic world? Is it Saudi Arabia, or is it Egypt, or is it Kemal Atatürk? So these are some of the questions, right, that were raised there. And a series of wars, a series of invasions that took place also caused the Muslim world to be, very morale is very low at that point of time for the Muslim world. Okay? But there were other episodes as well which got some of the Muslims in Malaysia excited in this region. One is the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a mass-based society that called for an alternative Islamic order, led by Hassan al-Banna. And of course, later, this struggle was carried out by Said Qutb. So it got some of the people here in this region attracted to that. How do we organize ourselves together after all those episodes I mentioned in the previous slide? That's one. Second, I want to go through the third point first. Wilayah-e-Faqih. You see this video playing at the side is the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini. I mentioned earlier that the majority of the Malays, Muslims in Southeast Asia are Sunnis. But something happened in 1979, which was the Iranian Revolution, where this 80-year-old cleric actually led a revolution in Iran, which actually toppled the Shah of Iran, or the King of Iran, who was pro-US at the point of time. What does this mean? It actually triggered some form of excitement that, hey, we have this guy who's old, and at the same time, who is a cleric, an ulama, and he leads this revolution. That means they're trying to say is that, hey, there's a role for Islam to decolonize the Muslim world, right? So actually, during this period is very interesting because a lot of some actually Southeast Asian Muslims moved or traveled to Iran to study this revolution, the Iranian Revolution, and wanting to form a political order, even though this is Shiism, and the Malays are Sunnis, but they want to study the political organization. which then leads to the second point, Salafi Wahhabism. And you know, geopolitically, the Persians or Iran has a rival, and the rival is basically Saudi Arabia until today, right? And hence, what happened was that it was when the period where there was a lot of sponsorship of petrodollars funded all over the world to support a counter ideology to the Iranian Revolution and the use of soft power in the form of promotion of Salafism and Wahhabism, the Puritan movement, as an alternative to the Shiism that was promoted by Iran. So my point is that geopolitical tensions, political developments in the Middle East in the 70s shaped the Islamic world here as well, right? So they were down, depressed, but now they see an alternative, and then they were attracted to this movement, which then sent me to another. It's not only Middle East impact. We also need to look at the local drivers, and it's always complex as well. There were competing voices. So students studying in the Middle East came back from different streams, brought add color to Islam in the region. But there were also local drivers. Urbanization was happening. Actually, people moving from villages to the towns, cities to study, to work. There was a strong campus movement. Local societies were also struggling because they just gained independence. And there was a crisis that happened in Malaysia, was the 1969 racial riots. In Indonesia was the military took over, the new order regime in 1966. So they were recovering. And what would they do? They wanted Islam to be a source of inspiration, Islam to be the driver to recover from these crises. And what happened? It coincided with the developments in the Middle East earlier, the political. So there was a lot of learning process, and different groups were actually targeting different ideas from the Middle East and bring it back here. So for those of you who are slightly, I wouldn't say old, but who actually witnessed this happening in the 80s, you might have seen the Al-Arqam movement, which is generally quite a Sufi tariqah movement as well, trying to promote an Islamic alternative. And then we have another group called the Abim, it's also trying to promote a de-Westernization and promotion of Islamization of knowledge that happened in that period of time, trying to create this Islamic alternative. So these are the local drivers that were happening during that period. So the last 10 minutes I will do this, but one often speaks of the Middle East impact, but they fail to see certain things. The role of the Middle East varies. Which Middle East country? Which ideology you're talking about? Which organization? Salafi Wahhabi, Muslim Brotherhood, Wilayah al-Faqih, Neo-Sufism, and even within this broad categories, there were also tensions. What kind of Salafism are we talking about? There were more, I would say, all ideologies, right? Could be violent, could be non-violent, right? So we need to understand the nuances. Second, beyond the Middle East impact, we need to look at local, regional drivers, right? They actually facilitated this. Sometimes we fail to see them. It could be many factors. Education, my third point, right? Education is one, travel, globalization, new media, whatever. So they're influenced by this, right? And certainly when we talk about Middle East impact, it's not only one impact. There are different kinds of impact. And this brings me to my last point. This is fairly a recent observation about the Middle East. Middle East is also not static. It is also undergoing social and political change. We tend to associate them with conservatism and lack of economic development at one point in time. But today, Middle East too is undergoing social change. People were excited in 2011 when the Arab Spring happened, but of course, didn't really materialize in many countries. But socioeconomically, in the future, right? Saudi Arabia is undergoing change. UAE is undergoing change. Egypt is undergoing change. So is Iran. Right? A lot of academic works, right, are trying to say that, hey, we need to go from the elite level of analysis to the more grounds up analysis, right, to understand that things are changing on the ground as well. Right, let's do a quick overview of some of this phenomena that's happening in the Malay world, and let's see where is the Middle East. One point is radicalism. Right? We often associate with Al-Qaeda or the recently ISIS threat. But look at some of these. Yes, most of them are influenced by Middle East thinkers, but there were also local drivers as well. Right? So we cannot deny that actually it works both. Right? So it's not solely Middle East. They may use sources from Middle East, but the drivers could be regional or local. Politics. We talk about influence of Middle East, but if you look at PAS in Malaysia, for instance, right? Which part of Middle East are we talking about? They were quite interested in the Iranian Revolution, right? When they redesigned their political party in the 1980s, we see similarities, right? In terms of the constitution change of the party, the role of the ulama or the clerics, in the party, right? Similar to that politically. But if you want to look at deep down in terms of that thinking, which Middle East country are we talking about? There is one ulama who's trained in Medina, one ulama who's basically trained in Al-Azhar, and another ulama who's trained locally. So which influence are we talking about here? Is it Wahhabism or is it Ikhwanul Muslimin? So a lot of some of this complexity that's happening in Malaysia. I wrote this article in the 2013 elections, because there was a lot of quoting of this fella, this ulama who's based in Qatar, Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. There's a lot of use of his ideas and thinking by both sides of the political spectrum. So I actually wrote this article. You can still read it. Rather than Malaysians voting, people will say that it's Al-Qaradawi, who's actually voting in GE13 and why it matters. You can still read this article. I think it's still available online. Similarly, in Indonesia, the PKS, of course, has gained attention. Its vote share has increased over the years. We want to see where its influence came from. If we look at its history, very much influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, the Tarbiyah movement. But who are the local drivers today? So I think we need to do further research. Or is it only PKS who's behaving this way? How about other organizations or other political leaders in the country? This slide was basically comparing two movements that has been banned recently: Hizb ut-Tahrir movement, Islamic Defenders Front (FDI). Hizb ut-Tahrir movement, of course, has its origins in the Middle East. But generally only became visible in 1998. Look at Islamic Defenders Front, there's been quite active in vigilante operations, but it's largely a local organization. It was banned in 2000. But look at, even though both may have influences from Middle East, Habib Rizik educated in Saudi and the Hizb ut-Tahrir movement influenced by the global movement. Look at the dates in which they became active. 1998. Here, I must emphasize, it's really a local factor that actually influenced why they became active. It's actually the fall of the Suharto regime in 1998 that actually allowed them to come to the surface and articulate their ideas. So there were actually local triggers to this phenomena. You might want to read this book. It's edited by me. It was in 2018. A chapter by Yon Mahmoudi was talking about the history of some of these movements on Indonesian campuses. I thought it's very good, simple reading overview of some of the origins and also the local manifestations of some of these movements on Indonesian campus. But we talk about the impact today. We also see that some of the drivers are not clearly Middle Eastern, like consumption habits, halal certification. This is something interesting. There's this drive for halal certification in Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore. Is it really a Middle Eastern phenomenon? I doubt so. Is it really somewhere that originated from the Middle East? I don't know. It could be local in the 80s, right? But my point is that there's also capitalism at play when we talk about Muslim behavior in this region as well. Right. So today we are concerned about Arabic dressing, culture and fashion, Arabization of society, using of Arabic words and greetings. Middle East is pure Islam and tainted local Islam, the dichotomy between Arabic and secular knowledge. These are all issues that have been raised recently. But I think we got to be careful when we look at this, and I think we need to really understand the origins and also the complexity of some of these debates. Indonesia today, I think they're quite active in this Sharia tourism and Sharia hotels and economic festivals dealing with Sharia. This is something that's ongoing. I'm still looking at this very, very closely. But the drivers of this are actually Indonesians themselves, and they're not the Middle Easterners. Of course, the Middle East also has a drive to do this, markets, but you can see the champions of this are very much the local ulama, not so much those from the Middle East. Yeah. I will conclude by looking at some other considerations regarding Middle East impact in Southeast Asia, mainly to drive my point that it's actually a complex phenomenon, this whole thing about Arabization. How do we explain that there are progressive thinkers? I consider them progressives because in terms of the issues they discuss, the thinking, as well as the ideas they're promoting, quite similar to some Western scholars looking at Islamic world as well. I'm not saying Western scholarship is always progressive compared to local scholarship, but in terms of the rational thinking, the embrace of science, embracing of modernity, putting things in context, I think some of these thinkers fit the bill of progressive scholars. We can debate about this, but some of them, Said Adil Siraj, very pro-pluralist thinking, was educated in Saudi Arabia. Quraish Shihab, one of the most prominent Quranic interpreters, trained in Al-Azhar University and gained his PhD there. And he has not been Western educated at all. So how do we explain this? Right? In Singapore, the famous Habib Hassan Alatas of the Ba'alawi Mosque, located at Bukit Timah area, very known for his interfaith work. Very strong Arabic roots, very much immersed in local society. How do we explain that? So it's not always Middle East impact is always negative. Again, same book. Here there's another chapter by Azhar Ibrahim, which he looks at translation works, very strong in Indonesia, of Indonesians translating progressive works, Hasan Hanafi, Muhammad Shatur, Abid Al-Jabiri, into Indonesia. There's a lot of reading culture, very, very good reading culture of progressive works as well from the Middle East. Then the debate comes in, and why not in Singapore and why not in Malaysia? Why do they shun this works? That's another debate altogether. And my last point is that Middle East itself is confronting change. There's ideological competition. This book by David Warren, a very recent book, talks about different ulamas or different icons promoted by different competing states, like Qatar is championing Yusuf al-Qaradawi, whereas UAE is championing somebody like Abdullah bin Bayya. This happens after Arab Spring. It's promoted to champion certain causes and the Islamic image that they're trying to bring in. So there's a very interesting work. I, of course, recently reviewed this book at Middle East, another MEI event. I'm very happy to do this. Sumanto Al-Qurtubi's work on Saudi Arabian Innovation Networks. We will talk about the complexity of Saudi Arabia. We tend to see Saudi Arabia as a very theological country, but I agree with Sumanto, and of course Sumanto has done more work than me on this area, in the outskirts, in other provinces in Saudi Arabia. Things are undergoing change, and which I argued further. Actually, you don't have to look far. In the borders of the Holy Land, Mecca and Jeddah, that's where the Holy Land's the borders. Society is also changing in Jeddah at the borders, right? So it's not static. Societies are not static. Why did I feature this book by Eric Traeger? Oh, he was looking at the Muslim Brotherhood phenomena, the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood. Because I think a lot of focus on Arabization discourse tends to be on Saudi and Wahhabism and Salafism. But the impact of the Ikhwan Muslimin, for instance, in terms of the thinking of Southeast Asian Muslims are rarely discussed, which I thought it's worth reading books like this. I must say that I'm, as I mentioned, a researcher dealing with Southeast Asia, but I do read these books because I was trying to see the linkages and networks between Southeast Asia and the Middle East. So conclusion, right? We need to rethink Arabization. We need to look at the socio-historical processes. One important event is the 1970s Islamic revivalism. We want to understand local dynamics. Terrorism is a concern, but there are also non-violent versions of political Islam. We need to look also at religious education in the Middle East, but not only the Middle East. When we talk about Singaporeans, we also need to look at religious education in the region to see whether if you want to tackle conservatism or political Islamist thinking, it's not always the Middle East. It could be the region as well. In terms of progressive voices, I argue that progressive voices have bigger space in Indonesia compared to Malaysia and Singapore. And these are areas that we can discuss further in the Q&A. Okay, I think I've spoken enough. Maybe it's time for questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, wonderful as always talk, and really summarizing a very long and complicated history for us and giving us much food for thought and questions. So again, I invite everyone to send in their questions via the chat functions. Send it to the MEI events team and I will present it to you. We will start with one of the questions that I received from Devin Neo. And Devin asks, why did the conservatism movement overtake the modernist? I think before this, I think I want to just if it's okay with you, just want to highlight that, that it's not necessary that conservatism and modernism are polar opposites or are in clash with each other. And they can often go, with Salafism, we see them go together. But yeah, if you could also add to this.
I'll take your last point. I think that's a very important point. We are not putting in boxes. These are basically ideal type categories. I would say that it depends on issues as well. There sometimes some groups are not consistent. They may be progressive on certain areas, but conservative on certain areas. So that's one. And within the same person itself, it could be, on gender issues could be conservative, or when it comes to interfaith could be more progressive. So that's complexity. But I'm just underlining that these are different typologies. So the question is very interesting and very good one. Why did the conservatives, generally overtake the modernists? We have to look at history. First and foremost, during the colonial period, talking about the Malay world, there was very little attempt to modernize local societies. We talked very highly about, during that period, there was education provided, modern education, access to modern institutions at the point of time. But we look at the natives and local societies, I think there were some limitations to that. Of course, the famous example was that Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi and his group of modernists tried to establish a modernist madrasa, but it didn't gain support. The period of time it had to close after a short period. So there was challenges at the time in promoting modernism. Secondly, I think is the elites and the ruling class at that point of time, which were not too keen because the modernists could be in a way undermining the authority of the ruling elites. So one example I gave was earlier in one of the slides was Hamka's criticism of the Johor Mufti. And as I mentioned, the Johor Mufti is tied to the Johor ruling class. So attacking them is also attacking the ruling class in a way, right? So that's why I think it did not take off. Right? The modern groups did not take off. And then move a few decades after that, during the independence period, right? Again, in Malaysia in particular, I think the conservatives were the ones who won on the eve of independence compared to the modernist movements. Indonesia is slightly more complex because we can say that the Islamist voice were defeated. But of course, there was a political struggle then. So Indonesia actually, initially, the progressive voices made headway. During Sukarno and Suharto, it made way. In fact, if you read a recent book, I can't remember the title now, looking at Muslim education, Suharto was actually allowing these young Muslim scholars to travel to the West to learn about Islam. So in a way, it actually generated a lot of modernist thinking. But after the fall of Suharto, that's why I say Indonesia is generally a more relatively later phenomena that conservatives were beginning to gain a bit of ground. So these are the course of history that actually shaped Islamic thinking.
If I could just add on to that question and ask you to elaborate a little bit on a point that you made about Indonesia being more conducive for progressive versions of Islam compared to Malaysia. Is that, as you point out, because of in Malaysia, Islam was so closely tied to kingship and state rule that room was curtailed, or are there sort of other factors too? Or I'm wondering if you could elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, we can't generalize that much, but I think it also depends on the kind. It's not, we shouldn't be blaming on certain groups only, but of course, many other factors and intervening factors. I mean, in terms of the history, it's very tied to the royal courts, and until today, in fact, the courts still has a significant role in shaping the religious life. Some of the Malay rulers were actually progressive as well. I mean, they tried to curtail some of these conservative voices, check them, especially after the 1970s. We can see that the monarchy played a critical role. They became the promoters of multiracialism or multi-religious discourse. So it's flipped to the other way. So there were many factors. First, it could be political. In Malaysia, and this is a classic case, it was during the resurgence period was when Mahathir Muhammad's first premiership in 1981 was actually the peak period of the Muslim resurgence. So we have people like Abim was very strong, Darul Arkam was very strong, Al Arkam was very strong at one time. So people like Anwar Ibrahim was very active on campus, promoting this kind of Islamic discourse. So what did Mahathir do at the point of time was actually, and of course, PAS, Islamic Party, as I mentioned earlier, was also gaining ground with this whole the leadership of the ulama. So the Islamic voices were actually pushing very strongly. So what Mahathir did at one point in time was actually to co-opt this into the administration. And this was a famous case of Anwar Ibrahim joining UMNO in 1981. So the strategy, and I've written about this, is basically to Islamize, to bring this whole Islamic agenda as part of the government. And its implication happens 30 years down the road today. So it became a state's agenda. One example is, of course, Islamic banking and finances are all funded and sponsored, supported by the state. Now, Indonesia is different. Suharto also faced that problem of Islamization, but he did not give in as much. In fact, what he did was actually to promote this progressive groups, be it in the universities, sending them to the Western universities to understand, to study from Fazlur Rahman in Chicago. So when they came back, they were articulating a different kind of discourse to basically compete with these Islamizers, right? And hence we see that room of discourse happening. Things change, of course, after Suharto fell. And what we're seeing in Indonesia today is slowly creeping this Islamization. But Indonesia still has that counter voices that Suharto invested in the 80s. That's quite interesting comparatively.
Thank you. We have another question from Zainul Rashid. And he's asking, he says, thank you, Dr. Nurul, for an excellent comprehensive presentation. And his question is, what do you think of Singapore's approach and emphasis on contextualization in interpretation and practice of Islam?
Contextualization is important, but we need to further understand what it means. I mean, you look at the current attempts by Indonesia and Malaysia state, they always talk about contextualization. Everybody talks about promoting moderate Islam. Everybody talks about promoting contextual Islam. But what does it mean? At one time, Malaysia was promoting Islam Hadari, 10 values. But we are more interested not in the 10 values. We are more interested in how these 10 values are operationalized through policies, through attempts. And you know, after 2008 elections in Malaysia, because there was a lot of tensions happening in Malaysia at that point of time. So again, we should stop. I mean, it's a good attempt to contextualize, but we need to go deeper into what it exactly means. Singapore, I think we hear regularly, we hear about this whole idea of contextualization. I applaud that. But this is based on my recent work on the students, Singapore students in the Middle East. A lot of it is targeted to the religious elite, going to the Middle East, studying in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Kuwait, you know, and the messaging is for them to contextualize. I say it's a very good move. Nobody is denying that. But contextualize to what? That's the other thing, you know. What is the standard of contextualization that we want the students to adhere to? Because we tend to think that the students or those who are studying in the Middle East, we tend to think that they are very much influenced by Middle Easterners. They are very much influenced by Puritan thinking or conservative thinking. Actually, based on my study, the Singaporean students in the Middle East are quite isolated from their counterparts in the Middle East. Right? So the issue of contextualization is not so much Middle East or Arabization that's happening. We need to also look at what's happening in the region itself. Influences from Malaysia, from Indonesia. We're talking about Singapore here, right? Influences from the social media. So contextualization has to also look at the impact of these regional states rather than focusing so much on Middle East. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have another question, this time from Clemens here at MEI, one of my colleagues here. And Clemens is asking that, here that we've been at MEI, we've been looking at changes within Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and sort of their shift from a Wahhabist to a more modernist or sort of at least a moderate version of Islam. Have you experienced either in your research or personal experience that change in the Gulf or in Saudi Arabia sort of cascading into Southeast Asia as well? Has there been any impact of that shift already?
Good question. Very, very good question. I've been to Saudi Arabia a few times over the last 2 decades. I must say at least 6 or 7 times been there, be it for Hajj or mere pilgrimage. And I've been able to see the changes happening in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca and Medina itself. I still remember the first time I was there in 2003. We can't even take video cameras. They said this is haram. This is forbidden. There was no internet connection at all. I was still a student and I need to bid modules at NUS. I can't because I have no internet connection. No internet connection at all. 2008 same, I was performing my Hajj at that point of time. No internet connection, still very much conservative. So my father was carrying a video camera and he was actually told off. This is not Islamic. But look at the situation now. People taking phones while encircling the Kaaba, so things have changed. Internet connection, no problems. They're quite advanced. So that's one example, personal example. Second example is about fashion. If you read Saudi news, I read almost every day Saudi newspapers. We can see that fashion is something that is promoted. We can say that this is a Saudi newspaper or this is a Western newspaper. So there's a shift. And I was in Saudi just before COVID restrictions, actually 2020 in March I was there. Significant change from the previous visits is that women are manning the counters in hotels. Women are now the immigration officers. And this was never happened in the past. So it's changing. The second argument is whether change is fast or slow. I must say change is very slow, but it's happening. It has to happen. You cannot resist change. But the speed of change is something that we should be discussing. And I must say that in Mecca and Medina and in the holy cities, change is relatively slow. But if you talk to people at Sumanto, whose book I discussed, I think he would have a different view because he's teaching in the provinces which are far from the holy sites. In Jeddah, it's different as well. It's very much any other cities in the world. So the issue is that sometimes we have an image of the country. We should not make the mistake of Orientalism. We tend to paint the country as one homogeneous entity without understanding the ground or without setting our foot in that country. Things are undergoing change, definitely.
Thank you. I have a question from my side. I mean, we've been talking here about the influence of the Middle East to Southeast Asia, but this discussion has generally been about the Arab world's influence onto Southeast Asia. But if we look at it historically, I mean, there's other important vectors of influence or the channels of Islam, be it South Asia, be it Persia, or Turkey. So how are these three areas, sort of the non-Arab brands or version of Islam, coming to Southeast Asia? We rarely ever hear about, we hear about Arabization of Islam in Southeast Asia, but we don't hear about Persianization, Southeast Asian or Indianization of Islam. Why is that? Is the nature of Islam different, or is it sort of, our own blind sides kind of?
So there's many factors to this. One is education, where our people are, learning about Islam. So that's why I think the privilege is Middle East, because again, in terms of data itself, our students, madrasa students, 50% of them will go to the Middle East, 50% will go to Malaysia. Actually, that's very rough, I guess. And if you look at the universities, very few of them, in fact, close to none, actually goes to Tehran, for instance, or Qom, to study religion. Most of them will go to Egypt, Al-Azhar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait. One or two in Libya, interestingly. So that's the reason why perhaps the influence there. Secondly, it's about travel. I mean, of course, Mecca is natural because of the holy sites. Egypt would be second, I would say, because of, again, historical significance. Other factors, I would say South Asia is also interesting, but it's under-researched. It's under-researched. Actually, it is significant because for Singapore's context of the Indian Muslim community. This one, let's do a research. But the dynamics is very interesting. I'm interested to find out as well how many of them actually travel to the Middle East to study. I mean, the Indian Muslim community choose Middle East, or do they go to India or Pakistan, right? Study religion. So again, I don't have the data here. On your other countries in the Middle East, like Turkey, it is, I mean, these countries are also exercising soft power, especially Turkey. There is actually, because you need to understand the internal dynamics in Turkey itself. At one point of time, the Gulen movement is very strong in Indonesia. Again, the chapter by Yon Mahmudi, I think he mentioned about some of these Turkish movements on campus. The Nursi movement is also quite strong. I encountered some students who actually go to Turkey to study in their universities. The universities are very modern, in a way, technology-wise. Thinking-wise, we haven't really analyzed. So the movements are there, and they're exercising soft power as well. But of course, this happened before the tension in Turkey, right? The political tension between Gulen movement and the state, which actually altered everything altogether. Just one final anecdote. I was doing my field research when I was doing my PhD in Indonesia. I attended a big book fair at the Senayan Stadium. It's very big. Can you imagine the Senayan Stadium that big in Indonesia? Book fair, and I encountered some of these Turkish books. They are read, they're translated. That means the influence is very strong in Indonesia as well.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Clemens, and sort of it builds on, like the vectors of influence, a question of vectors. One of them was like charity networks, which were very influential in Southeast Asia, particularly charity networks from the Gulf. Have you seen, and sort of, these were the subject of both observation and sort of like crackdown in the post 9/11 context. Has this crackdown sort of really limited them? Have they changed? What is the situation of these charity networks now?
I don't have the data to that, but there's a lot of been written, especially the point I mentioned earlier about the petrodollars, of course, funding, and of course, soft power promoting Salafism and Wahhabism that's happening. I don't really have it. I think there is the same book. I'm not trying to promote this book, but there's another chapter here by Faisal Musa that talks about, now that you mentioned this, it talks about the Rial and Ringgit Petro-Islam. You might want to read that chapter. That deals with Malaysia in terms of the flow of funds. But the other issue is this. What is associated with funding? Sometimes people think, right? People think that, comes funding, people will be influenced with their ideology, right? For instance, people tend to assume that, money comes from Saudi Arabia, they all become Wahhabis. Actually, that's not true. I encountered an experience in Batam, neighboring Batam. There was a lot of interest because there was this radio channel that people say is promoting Salafism. So I was very interested in Batam Muslims at one point in time. I actually published a very small book. You might want to read it. It's on Batam Muslims. It's free for download. So I encountered one where they said that they got funding from Middle East, but largely Sufis. They still promote the traditional Islam. I would expect that this bid'ah or this is innovation, but no. So there's no strings attached to it. So it's either they just take the money and then they continue and nobody finds out. So things are more complicated than what people think, you know. There's money and then they have to follow a certain ideology. That doesn't work that way all the time.
No, that's very true. That's very true. There's a big, there's a complex sociological process that leads from money to sort of ideological changes.
Exactly.
And when we always, often like skip on that because money is easier to see, easier to trace, but those other things are harder to trace. But if we're on the question of money, I want to add another question. And this question is about you mentioned sort of, consumption being one of the drivers of Islam or in Southeast Asia. I remember in early 2000 Pakistan, there was a while where everyone was talking about how Malaysia needs to be the model of Islam everyone needs to follow. How forget about Saudi Arabia, forget about all these other places. Malaysia is the case to follow, and it was largely promoted by the growth of the riba-free banking industry and the halal industry. I'm wondering, like, how significant are these two sort of industries in shaping the kind of Islam or sort of shaping the nature of Islam in Southeast Asia?
Oh, very good question. Yeah, I mean, you're right, and good that you shared that idea that that Malaysia used to be the model. Malaysia was actually one of the first to champion this whole idea of Islamic banking, because as I mentioned earlier, it was actually promoted by the state, right? Because of the co-optation that happened. So the state became the driver of this, promoting this Islamization from within. But the other issue about Malaysia is that there was a growing middle class. And Malaysia under Mahathir, if you remember, was basically a rising tiger of Southeast Asia. It was a growing middle class and becoming more religious. So they were actually pushing for an alternative to Westernization, and hence we have all this coming up. But initially, this whole Islamization phase only started in Islamic banking and finance and halal certification, right? It started in the 80s, but not on other aspects. Of course, dealing became more common in Malaysia at the point of time. But today is different. Today, Indonesia seems to be stronger at championing this due to political developments. Politicians are also driving this. I mean, I attended some of these conferences. They were available. Every time you read the Indonesian newspaper, there's always promotion of Sharia banking and finance. It's quite interesting. We are trying to find out who are the drivers of this. I would say that Indonesia is a latecomer to this, but given its sheer size, its population, market, it will be definitely be a stronger player when it comes to this, right? So they are now into halal certification and Islamic banking and finance. And Indonesia is also experiencing a rising middle class. So there was a lot of social influencers now promoting packages to Japan or Korea, but Sharia, Sharia endorsed or Sharia compliant. That's the term that you Sharia compliant tourism. So it's getting bigger each day, and it's interesting as well because Indonesia being the driver of this. So because it trades with some of these countries in the Pacific, and China also wants to penetrate the Middle Eastern market. So I noticed when I was doing my field work, some of these goods actually came all the way to Indonesia, got endorsed by MUI, the Indonesian Council, and then to be exported elsewhere. So there is this growth of capitalism that's going on, that's happening, that's actually driving all these forces. So that's one phenomenon. The other phenomenon is, of course, social consumption. So Indonesia is so big as a market for Islamic dramas, Islamic cinema, Islamic fashion. It's growing.
Thank you. I have another question from one of my colleagues here at MEI, Asif Shusha, and he's asking, how do you view Sukmawati Sukarnaputri giving up Islam?
That's her right. I have not really seen. I mean, jokes aside, it's her right I mean, religion. We are into freedom of religion. It's a right. Anyone is free to embrace whatever religions he or she chooses. But in terms of the reactions on the ground, we don't really see that much traction on the ground. And that's what I'm more interested in, because we tend to think that Indonesians are becoming more conservative turn, more Islamist, but doesn't really make the news. But quite interesting. Indonesian society, they are so pluralist, I would say, that within the same family, they can have different faiths. Husbands and wives could have different faiths. We hear a lot of this. Whether we agree that this is progressive or not, I think, but that's an interesting phenomenon for me that we won't see in Singapore and Malaysia.
No, that's very interesting. I have another question from this is a question from Zainul Rashid, and it's related to the discussion that we were having about Islamic banking and the halal market. And he's asking, do you think there's a role Singapore can play? Is there a space for, like, can Singapore carve out a space for itself within this market?
Of course, Singapore can definitely. I mean, people are looking for good banks. Good banks that pays. We are capitalist society. Whatever earns the best interest, But I think this whole idea of Islamic banking, we have to understand the history of it and how it evolves. My attitude is that if you want to encourage or build a certain system, make sure it's good and efficient. It's your right. People say that this is a business model or capitalism. Yeah, I mean, we are free to do that. But I'll be careful sometimes when we use the Islamic label, right? Because if we use the Islamic label, then we tend to think that, hey, how about the other? Is it non-Islamic? Whereas there are actually alternative opinions on the ground. This is where I think the ulamas play a huge role to educate society. I leave it to the choice of the people to decide if they feel that Islamic banks is suitable for them, pays them good interest, no interest, sorry, riba is haram, or they pay them good dividends. They're free to do that. But I'll be very careful if we want to tend to if it leads to dichotomization that this is Islam and this is not Islam, because there's a history to this. A very, very, very must-read book is Timur Quran. It's very difficult to buy the book, so I bought an ebook. And he was the one who actually traced this whole idea of Islamic banking and problems and issues facing it. He has another book called The Long Divergence, also very good, tracing it from the Ottoman Empire, this whole idea of certain laws and regulations about Islamic banking and society. Timur Quran is a very critical person, but it's a very interesting read to understand the whole history of Islamic banking. Whether Singapore has a role to play in the market, Singapore can play in anything as long as it's efficient, effective, and it serves the people well.
Thank you. I have a question here from Gerald, and he is asking sort of a very timely question about COVID-19 and its impact. During this time, we saw the channels of movement and so on being severed for a while. Did that slow the relationship or the rate of or changes in Islam in these areas, or did it impact it? This kind of disconnection?
Changes in Islam in the areas, in the Middle East, or
yeah, so the movement from Middle East to Southeast Asia.
COVID-19. Nowadays, we don't talk about movements of people anymore. This is basically the 18th and 19th century. We're talking about the digital era. So in terms of the flow of ideas, I think there is no change. In fact, it's faster now with digitization. So in terms of impact and change, it doesn't really affect. Yeah, in terms of flow of people, definitely. But talking about digitization itself, and talking about this content of Arabization, and COVID-19 actually accelerates this. When we talk about digital space, it's not so much Middle Eastern influence Southeast Asia anymore. A good survey of the young in Southeast Asia, who they are listening to, will be interesting. So again, I'm generalizing. I mean, this is based on some of my limited findings of my research on the students. People are reading Hamza Yusuf. People are reading US-based thinkers. People are reading Mufti Menk. Right? People are reading who's the guy who actually is now in Malaysia? I can't remember.
Zakir Naik?
Zakir Naik.
Yeah.
So it's not listening so much to Middle East. They're looking at other sources. So we need to question as well. So I think if you want to understand conservatism, which is an important research agenda, rising conservatism, rising Islamism, or anti-pluralism voices, we need to look at this based on the discourse. It's not fashionable, I know. Tackle the discourse rather than tackle where it is from solely. Of course, it has multiple origins. That's why my argument is that we tend to think of Middle East impact. We forgot the regional impact. We tend to forget the regional impact of political Islam.
So, no, I think that's a very important reminder.
That's why one of my slides I said that do not blame the Middle East all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have another question from Zainul Rashid, and it's a question related to sort of the point that you make about the Vilayat Faqih movement and sort of the influence from Iran complicating, the thing. So he's asking about like how did this influence from Iran with sort of its Shia sort of baggage shape the Sunni dominant version of Islam in Southeast Asia?
Very complex question. What is Shia influence? Before Iranian Revolution, it's very difficult to also say that there's totally no Shia influence in everything. Of course, as I mentioned, right, the space itself is so wide that there are multiple influences in different aspects of our social life. Shia communities have been in this region for the longest time and didn't have problems. So it's only in the 1970s that they started to actually have fatwas against this community. So that's the historical bit. I think influences of the Bidayah Faqih, this is based on my experience of interviewing some of these muftis, leading ulama, who are very much born in that era, or actually experiencing the Iranian Revolution. So you're telling me this. Interestingly, in his house, all the Shi'i kitabs, all the Shi'i readings, but he's a mufti in Malaysia, and it's forbidden to be a Shi'i, right, in Malaysia. And he has to be a Sunni. No, he cannot be a Mufti. But interesting, he said this: we learn Shiism, we want to study the best of that system, but we remain Sunnis. My suspicion, and again comparing political parties or the way politics developed in Malaysia, they were very much interested in the revolutionary aspects of it. They were very interested in the political aspect and organization of their parties and state. So we have the shura system, the council of ulama. You have democracy. You can vote, but there's a supreme council. There's a ulama. Hey, look, PAS is like that, isn't it? PAS in Malaysia. We have the spiritual leader. We have the shura council. We have elections. So I suspect there's that influence from Iran. But it's not only Iranian that they're interested in. As I mentioned earlier, actually most of the influence of current thinking in the region it comes from the Ikhwanul Muslimin. Actually, it's not Wahhabism. A lot of people tend to think it's Wahhabism. I would say we need to study deeper the impact of Ikhwanul Muslimin. I think I shared the book on the slide, but this book which I bought by Eric Traeger. I read it a few times actually. It's very good because it's showing how Ikhwan Muslimin behave during authoritarian period. And when it saw the opportunity to get to power, when it got to power, it implemented what it wanted to do, and that led to its downfall. It's a pragmatic organization. And I encountered in my experience of traveling to one of the conferences in Turkey, they were talking similar fashion. And Eric Traeger actually traced this. There are 7 steps to Islamic State. So they're pragmatic stage, when you share power, then when you get to power, what you will do. I was amazed that actually that it's this organization who talks in similar fashion. So I was thinking then at one time, hey, we should not discount the Ikhwan Muslimin's impact in social religious life and political life of Southeast Asia.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I have a few more questions, but maybe people can ask you directly. As always, this was fascinating and absolutely, like enlightening discussion. So thank you so much for joining us today and talking to us. And thank you everyone for listening in. Please do keep tuned in to the MEI 101 series and other events that are posting. Thank you everyone. Have a good evening.